It was the kind of night where the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that seemed to settle deep into your bones. The sky was covered by thick clouds, the moon barely visible through the layers of mist that crept along the ground. It was a night when things just didn't feel right. The kind of night where even the most mundane tasks seemed to carry a weight, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on you. Yet, for the group of college friends on their way to the old house on the hill, this night would prove to be more than just uncomfortable. It would be the night their lives would change forever. Emma, the practical one of the group, had heard the rumors about the house. Everyone had. It was the kind of place that made its rounds in local stories: abandoned, cursed, haunted. People had gone in, but no one had come out quite the same. Some had disappeared entirely. Others came back, different. It was the kind of house that clung to its dark past like a shadow, refusing to let go. Emma, being the skeptic, had brushed it off. She laughed when her friends spoke of it, dismissing it as nothing more than ghost stories to keep them entertained during late-night parties. But tonight, Emma's laughter would soon turn to unease. The rest of the group wasn't so dismissive. John, the thrill-seeker, was the one who suggested they go. "Let's just check it out." "How bad could it be?" he had said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Sarah, who had always been a bit too curious for her own good, eagerly agreed. Even Jake, who was usually the quiet one, couldn't resist the idea of experiencing something real, something terrifying. And so, they found themselves in the rusted old truck, heading toward the hill that was said to house the abandoned mansion. The journey itself was uneventful, except for the occasional joke about ghosts or haunted spirits. They joked about the stories they had heard over the years of the family that once lived there, who had mysteriously vanished one stormy night, leaving behind only their broken belongings and an eerie silence. As the truck finally reached the base of the hill, Emma's stomach twisted. She had always assumed the stories were exaggerated, but now, as she looked up at the silhouette of the house in the distance, she felt a cold shiver run through her. It wasn't just the wind. There was something wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a sense of dread that seemed to weigh heavy in the air. The house loomed ahead, its windows shattered, and its doors hanging crookedly off their hinges, as if the house itself was breathing, sighing under the weight of its age. The gates were broken, half covered in ivy and dirt, as though the house hadn't been touched in decades. The smell of decay hung in the air, and despite the chill, there was a thick, suffocating warmth inside that seemed to beckon them closer. "We're here," John said, his voice filled with excitement, though there was a tremor of uncertainty in it that didn't go unnoticed by the others. Sarah was the first to get out, her boots crunching against the dry ground as she walked toward the front door. Emma hesitated for a moment before following her, the sound of her footsteps feeling unnaturally loud against the silence of the night. The others followed, but no one spoke. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive quiet that made Emma's skin prickle. The door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to everything. The walls, once elegant, were now stained and cracked, peeling wallpaper hanging off in tatters. John led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move with them as they ventured deeper into the house. "This is insane," he said, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "Can you feel that? It's like the house is alive." Emma felt it too. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, as if something was watching them, waiting. She looked back toward the door they had entered, but it seemed farther away than it had when they first stepped in. They walked through the main hall, past old furniture covered in white sheets, and through rooms that looked as if time had simply stopped. There was no sign of life, just dust, decay, and the feeling that something was very wrong. The silence was deafening, and the only sound was the soft shuffle of their footsteps on the old, creaking floorboards. The first thing that truly unsettled them was the staircase. It was at the end of a long hallway, its banister twisted and broken. The stairs themselves were worn and unstable, as if they hadn't been used in decades. But what really caught their attention was the faint, rhythmic tapping sound that echoed from above. At first, they thought it was just the house settling. But as the sound continued, growing louder and faster, they realized it was something else. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Emma nodded, her heart racing. I don't know what it is." John, determined to prove there was nothing to fear, made his way up the stairs, his flashlight illuminating the dark, narrow steps. "It's probably just a rat or something," he said, his voice trying to sound casual, though there was an edge of nervousness in it. "I'll check it out." "John, wait." Sarah called out, but he was already halfway up. The rest of the group hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, fear growing in their chests with each passing second. The tapping continued, and now there was a low, guttural sound mixed with it, like something dragging across the floor. John reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner. The moment he did, a horrible, deafening scream pierced the air, a sound so unnatural that it made the hairs on the back of Emma's neck stand on end. "John!" Sarah screamed, rushing up after him. But by the time they reached the top, John was nowhere to be found. His flashlight lay on the floor, its beam illuminating an empty hallway. The air was thick with tension, and the group stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of their breath was all they could hear. "John!" Emma shouted, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny." But there was no answer. The group, now in a state of panic, began searching the upper floor. Every room they entered was empty, save for the strange feeling of being watched. The deeper they went into the house, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them into more darkness, more cold silence. And then they heard it, the sound of something moving, just ahead of them. A shadow darted across the wall, and for a split second, Emma thought she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "We need to get out of here." But just as they turned to leave, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening crash. The air grew colder, and the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from behind them. Emma spun around, but the hallway was empty, nothing but darkness. The door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with such force that the walls seemed to shake. A deep, echoing thud reverberated through the floor, the sound like a death knell. Emma, her heart pounding in her throat, spun toward the others. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jake's hands trembled, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out at him from the shadows. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. Emma swallowed hard, her own fear beginning to claw its way up her throat. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound calm. But when they turned to leave, the hallway behind them seemed to stretch further than it had before. The walls, which had once seemed static and confining, now felt like they were closing in around them, as though the house itself was pushing them deeper inside. The oppressive air was suffocating, thick with a sense of wrongness, of something unnatural lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. "What's happening?" Jake whispered, stepping back, his hand brushing against the peeling wallpaper. Emma didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the door at the end of the hallway, which, impossibly, had closed behind them with a force that couldn't have come from the wind alone. There was no breeze, no reason for it to have slammed shut so violently. Her chest tightened as she felt the weight of the house pressing in on them. Maybe we can force the door open," John suggested weakly, though his voice lacked the bravado it had moments before. The confidence he had shown earlier had evaporated, replaced by the same fear that now gripped the rest of them. John took a hesitant step toward the door, reaching out to grab the handle, but as soon as his hand touched it, the temperature dropped drastically. His fingers numbed, as though the very air around him had turned to ice. He jerked his hand back, startled, his breath now coming out in a visible cloud. The shadow that had flickered down the hallway earlier now seemed to move again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a mere shape, not a trick of the light. It was something solid, something that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. The temperature in the air dropped further, the chill creeping down Emma's spine as she felt the presence of something malevolent gathering around them. "Did you see that?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. Emma nodded, her heart racing. "We need to move. Now." But the hallway had changed. It wasn't the same as when they had first entered. The walls seemed to stretch farther than they should have, the dim light from their flashlights creating long, monstrous shadows that twisted and writhed as if they were alive. The floor creaked underfoot, each step echoing like a warning. The house, once still and silent, now seemed to hum with an eerie, almost imperceptible vibration, like the entire building was holding its breath. "Where's John?" Jake asked suddenly, panic rising in his voice. They all froze. Emma's breath hitched in her chest. She hadn't noticed it at first, but now that Jake mentioned it, she realized John was no longer standing beside them. The hallway ahead, which had been clear just moments ago, was now dark, utterly and oppressively dark. The faint outline of the door at the end of the hallway was now obscured by a heavy, swirling fog that hadn't been there before. "John," Sarah called out, her voice a desperate wail. Nothing answered, except for the slow, rhythmic sound of something dragging across the floor, coming closer from the darkness. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, the dragging noise growing more insistent, more frantic, like someone or something was crawling toward them. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she looked frantically around, trying to understand what was happening. But the hallway seemed endless now, stretching out before them into an impossible darkness. The walls seemed to bend and shift, their angles warped in a way that defied reason. "John?" Emma called out, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. No one responded. The dragging noise was louder now, growing closer by the second. "Let's get out of here," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with the kind of terror that could freeze blood. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned to flee, the house seemed to shift again. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and a deep, guttural groan filled the air, the sound of something ancient and twisted waking from a long slumber. Emma turned back toward the door at the end of the hallway, but it was no longer there. Instead, there was a wall. The familiar darkness was gone, replaced by an empty, looming surface, as if the house had swallowed the door whole. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with fear. The dragging noise was now right behind them, too close. They spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty hallway. "Run!" Emma shouted. Without another thought, they sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps heavy and panicked, the sound of their own heartbeats drowning out all other noise. The floor beneath them seemed to undulate, as if the house itself was alive, shifting underfoot to trap them. They reached the end of the hallway, but instead of the door they expected, there was nothing. Just a cold, dark wall, looming, suffocating. The sound of dragging was closer now. Emma could almost feel it on her skin, like cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. Her eyes frantically searched the hallway, looking for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. The house was closing in on them. "Please, please, God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here." But the house wouldn't let them. The walls seemed to shift and bend, creating a maze of endless corridors and empty rooms. The air was thick with a suffocating fog that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The shadows moved, stretching and contorting into shapes that no longer resembled anything human. Emma felt the weight of the house closing in on them, its oppressive presence like a living, breathing entity that was suffocating them. The temperature dropped again, so cold that her breath came out in ragged clouds of mist. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything they had heard before. It was deafening. "John!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "Where are you? Please, answer me." But there was no answer. There never was. Only the deep, hollow silence of the house, stretching out before them like an unending abyss. Suddenly, Emma felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. Her eyes darted to the others, but they were frozen too, eyes wide with terror. It was as if they had all heard it, the same thing. That feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Something was in the room with them. Something that wasn't human. And then, from the corner of the hallway, they saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, its face a twisted mask of sorrow and rage. Its eyes were black voids, hollow and empty, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The figure lurched forward, dragging itself along the floor with slow, deliberate movements. Its limbs were twisted, its body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The dragging noise had started again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. The sound of whispering. "Get out," the voice hissed, 1,000 whispers all at once. "Get out, before it's too late." Emma stumbled back, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was no use. There was no explanation, no reason. Only the overwhelming, suffocating presence of the house, and the thing that had been following them all along. "Run," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. But it was too late. The figure lunged at them, its limbs snapping and twisting unnaturally as it moved faster than any human should. They ran. But the house would never let them leave. They were trapped. The air grew colder, and the darkness around them seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The house, once just an abandoned relic, now felt alive, as if it were feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing second. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, the icy air biting her lungs as she sprinted down the hallway. Her heart pounded against her chest, and her mind was clouded with panic. The figure, the thing they had seen, was behind them, its movement swift, too swift. It was getting closer. "Run!" Emma screamed again, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own footsteps. But the hallway, which had once seemed so long and endless, now felt impossibly vast. The walls seemed to close in, the floor shifting beneath her feet, twisting and warping like a maze. Every corner she turned, every door she threw open, led only to more of the same, dark, empty rooms that seemed to stretch into infinity. The shadows clung to the corners, hiding things she wouldn't look at. Each flicker of the flashlight's beam seemed to reveal new horrors, new shapes moving just out of sight. "Please, please, no," Sarah whimpered, her voice shaking with terror. She had fallen behind. Emma could hear her struggling, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her footsteps growing slower, more erratic. She turned briefly to glance back, but it was a mistake. The thing was there, closer now. Its figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs thin and elongated, its hands ending in sharp, claw-like fingers that scraped against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Its face was a hollow, gaping mask, its eyes wide black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Sarah screamed. Emma's stomach turned as she saw Sarah's figure, trapped in the thing's grip. It dragged her across the floor, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the terror. Sarah's screams were muffled, choked out by the thing's grip around her throat. "Sarah!" Emma screamed, but her voice was lost in the vast, echoing silence. She turned back and ran, desperate to get away, but the house itself seemed to be turning against them, twisting, reshaping, shifting the hallways and doors in ways that made no sense. It was as if the house were alive and hungry. "Jake! Jake, where are you?" Emma cried out, but the silence around her was oppressive, suffocating. She heard him before she saw him. The low, guttural sound of something scraping along the floor, dragging itself behind her. The sound was unmistakable now, the thing was close. It had to be. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Jake. But not Jake as she remembered him. His face was twisted, gaunt, pale. His eyes were wide, too wide, the whites showing, bloodshot and unblinking. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his hands outstretched, fingers twitching like they were trying to grab her, pull her into the darkness with him. "Jake," Emma whispered, her heart breaking. "What happened to you?" But before she could move, the thing appeared again, slithering out of the shadows. Its eyes were locked on her now, and it let out a low, guttural growl, almost like a chuckle, as it slowly advanced toward her. Emma backed away, her mind racing, her chest tightening with each step. "Get away from me," she shouted, though her voice sounded weak, even to her own ears. But the thing didn't listen. It never listened. It was always there, moving closer, faster now, its limbs stretching impossibly long. The hallway seemed to narrow, closing in on her, leaving her nowhere to run. Her breath was coming in short gasps, and the walls, once cold and decayed, now seemed to pulse with a sickening, rhythmic beat, like a heart, thumping in the dark. She could hear it, too, the whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, but then louder, sharper, growing in intensity with each passing second. Leave, 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 the voices whispered, but it wasn't the house. No, it was something far worse. Something older, more powerful. Something that had been waiting. Suddenly, the floor beneath her gave way. It was like falling into a pit, but without gravity. Her stomach lurched, and for a moment, the world tilted sideways. She reached out, desperate to grab something, anything, but her hands found nothing. The ground was gone, the walls had disappeared, and all that remained was darkness. Absolute, suffocating darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Emma landed hard, her body slamming into cold, unforgiving stone. Her vision blurred, her breath knocked from her lungs. She struggled to breathe, to move, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by chains. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet, her hands scraping against the jagged floor. She blinked, trying to clear the fog from her mind. Where was she? How had she gotten here? She glanced around, her heart sinking. She was in a room, a large, cavernous space, the air thick with dust and decay. But it wasn't like any room she had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ancient markings that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The floor was cracked, and in the center of the room, there was a large stone circle, etched with more symbols. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that pressed against her skin, suffocating her. And then she saw it. The figure. It was standing in the center of the circle. The thing that had been following them, chasing them. It was no longer just a shadow. No, it was something more, something far worse. Its body was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin arms that ended in sharp, claw-like hands. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was twisted, half human, half something else entirely. The eyes, those empty, black eyes, stared at her, unblinking. And then, to her horror, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a low, guttural hiss that reverberated in the back of her skull. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. What are you?" she managed to choke out. The thing tilted its head, its smile widening into something grotesque. "I am the house," it said, its voice rising, growing louder, filling the room with a chilling resonance. "And you, little one, are mine." Her blood ran cold. She tried to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The thing took a step toward her, its long fingers stretching out toward her, its claws glinting in the dim light. "No," she screamed, her voice filled with terror, but it was too late. The thing was upon her. And then, everything went black. The silence was overwhelming. The house, once alive with fear and malevolent energy, fell silent once more. There was no movement, no sound, just the faint, lingering echoes of terror. The darkness seemed to stretch on, endless and eternal. And in the distance, a door opened. A door that had long been closed. The house, with all its twisted, insidious secrets, had let them in. It had welcomed them. But now, it had taken them all. Forever.